We have been going, I guess, roughly 15, 16 years. So we had a kind of a not nebulous start, but like we didn't like start at one point. We were both Alice Casey, who's the other director of TAKA. We did our first project when we were both working for other people. So I was working for O'Donnell Tuomey, and she was working for Tom de Puer. And I think we started 4-day weeks, and then our day off, we were doing these kind of this first couple of houses for Alice's sister and her parents. So we kind of, and then shortly after I went full time to TAKA, Alice stayed in with Tom de Puer for a while, and then eventually we just kind of went off on our own. So I think our first built project was in about 2008. So.
I mean, of course, it says something about the architectural profession, right? That it takes a long time to be in a position to start a practice. I think to gain all that experience, to have a client, to then be able to have like a kind of standalone practice.
Exactly, because that like you leave college and you really don't know anything about the practice of architecture. You know about design and how to deal with concepts and ideas and articulate them into a building design, but there's obviously a whole other raft of things, particularly for me, it was about learning about construction properly, like being able to link a construction detail to something that is built on site, and that might be very messy in reality. Like there's the typical one about you draw a foundation as a rectangle, but it's actually a big splodge of concrete in a kind of a hole in the ground. So but that was a huge education for me as well, is that few years after college. I mean, Alice and I went to London for 3 years when we graduated in Dublin, and I worked for Niall McLaughlin there, and that period was just such a steep learning curve, and it was amazing kind of education in construction and the value of construction to the eventual art piece of architecture in the end. That it's a creative act. Technical detailing is a creative act, and there's language in that, and that language has a relationship to practical things like how water is shed, surface tension of water not getting into the building, wind pressure, all that kind of stuff. And there's a real beauty in that. You're dealing with kind of tangible physical things. And before that in college, it was about, oh, here's my design, how do I detail that design? So it kind of totally upended that kind of linear thing.
I think when you go into practice, you realize that this is going to take time. Like you think, oh, I'm young, I have so many ideas, I can do this very quick, like I can and especially you also talk to people from other creative fields like artists, designers, they come up with an idea, it's kind of a prototype is there the following day or sometimes very quickly within hours. But it seems that this profession really requires patience. And so have you ever had that moment of, oh wow, this actually is not going to be so quick?
No, I mean, I think they're not really the impatience so much. I really enjoyed that learning process after college, and the fact that I was still learning and there was more to learn and know, and I was kind of drinking that up, and I was kind of like enjoying that. But I do remember being terrified that I would never be capable of having my own practice, because when I worked for Neil, he was so amazing at everything. He was amazing, obviously designer, but technically, legally with clients, being able to speak amazingly, so it was kind of, I was like, I just went, I will never be able to do that. And that was my, that's the role model to start your own practice. And
I mean, that's quite a major role model, because Neil is quite formidable. So
formidable is the word. Yeah.
Could really put you off.
But so there were moments where I just go, I will never be capable of being that, and that's what I thought I had to be. But you can be
oh yeah, many things.
Yeah. So, but no, I don't really don't really remember being very impatient about things taking too long, or having to learn more to be able to do it. It just
I think I explained a little bit in my email, but really I'm tracing these lines of influence. And what I find really exciting is that, you know, Shane often talks about his influence being like a major influence in his work being Louis Kahn. And of course, he went to America, studied under Louis Kahn and worked for him, and sort of came back and educated a generation of architects, one of whom was Neil. I don't know if O'Donnell Tuomey were ever taught by Shane, but we're definitely part of that, I guess.
School of Architecture in UCD. Yeah, I don't know exactly the overlaps, but yeah, they would have either taught with or been taught by Shane at some stage. Yeah.
But so I guess maybe we're just interesting to understand how do you see yourself in relation to these figures? Of course, I mean, it might be interesting to maybe of course you curated an exhibition on the Black women Mies work at the Venice Biennale, but how do you trace this line of influence, this line of thought back to Neil via and Shane?
In relation to the Black women Mar, I mean, I feel like I've been surrounded by them my entire life. It's quite a random situation, but I grew up in a kind of a pretty random outer suburb of Dublin. And the church I was baptized in was Shane and John's first building, the Furhouse Church, like a couple of years after it was built. That was my local church, which is kind of a totally random connection. And then kind of growing up, I remember like every Sunday being in that church. And I don't know if you know this Furhouse Church building, but it's a series of concrete table structures that sit within this kind of concrete block walled garden. And there was, you know, in a very Canyon way, there was a very clear and beautiful, I suppose, expression of the layers of the construction. You know, the glazing was held away from the concrete columns and the table structures. And I remember just looking up at them and going, this is really interesting, not knowing why, and then moving in between the kind of separated columns and things like that. And then I brought a drawing of that to my interview to get into architecture school, and I didn't really know its significance. I knew it was kind of an interesting building, but then all the people on the interview panel were like, whoa, you know, this. So, and then like now I live on a lane and there's the Black and Mar house up the road. And one of our projects at the moment is actually to refurbish Shane's daughter's house, Catherine's house. So it's kind of, there's lots of connections there. When we kind of co-curated the show for Venice, along with, it was Alice and myself and Tom Dupuer and Peter Mabry. So we had kind of, you know, discussion meetings about that. And I mean, I think that project came about just like, as I was saying, Alice used to work for Tom, and we'd kind of go for drinks after work and just, you know, just talking about lots of different stuff. But the call for the Biennale came out, and I think Tom just went like, someone should do something on the Black and Mar. You know, they're so important to Irish architecture, like unbelievably important, but probably not very well known outside of Ireland, you know. And we're like, and myself and Alice were always huge kind of fans of the Black and Mar's work. And, you know, as are most people in Ireland, most architects in Ireland, to be honest, they're giants in, you know, 20th century Irish architecture, and they've been such an influence on everyone, like on Grafton's, on O'Donnell Tuomey, on Neil, you know, everyone. So yeah, we just decided to put together a proposal to be considered for the Biennale, the National Pavilion that year, and it was successful. It was accepted, and then we just went on the idea was really just to kind of disseminate to first kind of collect a version of their archive and their work, and then disseminate it in Venice to an international audience to kind of, you know, I suppose in some way bridge that thing of them being so massively important and into Irish architecture, but probably underrepresented internationally. So to try and change that a bit, I suppose.
And what's that significance? Where, like, what's the significant thing about their work?
Like, I guess I could only speak personally about it, really. I mean, I think before De Black and Mamar, the contemporary Irish architecture was kind of largely Miesian, and there's some very very good kind of Miesian building, mid 20th century Miesian buildings in Ireland. But for me, that didn't really feel like an Irish architecture, if you can call it that. You know, it felt like it was obviously international style. It was kind of brave and modern. But when I saw the Black Mamar's buildings, and I didn't at the early stages understand the kind of Cannian nature, or that kind of thing, you know, that connection. I just, looking at them as they were, and they felt very Irish. They felt very of the place, because I think something to do with the substantiality of the materiality, and the substance of the detailing, the fact that they were kind of more robust and rough, and that I always felt like that is contemporary Irish architecture. You know, it is of the place, but it's obviously not trying to be vernacular in any way. So that would be my view of why they're so influential, is that there's a substance to the architecture that seems to strike a chord.
Yeah. And a certain tectonic nature, the kind of heaviness.
Yeah.
That's probably then something that you recognized in the work of O'Donnell Tuomey and Niall as well.
Yeah.
So if we were to then really trace this line of influence in some way, as Shane taught Niall, and you worked in Niall's practice. So, and you've already spoken about this tectonic nature, the weight of the architecture, that there's something that resonates with as a kind of genuine expression of something that is local. What did you then take from, I guess, what did you take from Niall, or what did you take from O'Donnell Tuomey? And then maybe also, is there something that you've rejected?
I mean, I think, you know, stemming from CIAN to De Black and Mamar to Niall's, I think really what I learned in Niall's was a kind of an understanding of detailing as something environmental, but also craft-based, you know, so that it was less about kind of, here's a product, let's fit this product in, you know, that does happen, but there was a kind of an understanding of every aspect of a detail to deal with weather, deal with water, wind penetration, but that you could kind of tailor it and craft it. You know, you could craft, was, you know, amazing timber window details, you know, which De Black and Mamar definitely have, and, you know, Niall had, and just a kind of a learning about why they were the way they were, and not looking at them as some kind of foreign language, like understanding the language, and then, you know, being able to, once you're able to understand it, you're able to kind of change it, you know. But before that, it's just like, I have to just take this as it is, because I don't know what I'm dealing with. So, and I think that was a profound change for me personally, you know, because then, coming from a student who was kind of slightly indifferent towards construction, and then coming out of Niall's to feeling like construction is a huge part of architecture and the language of architecture. And I think that carried on into our practice, definitely, that we really rely on the substance, the materials that we're using to create the architecture. You know, that's part of the process of making the language of the buildings. You know, less so than, you know, here's a form, let's see how we can detail that so it doesn't leak. You know, it's definitely not that, which it would have been before I went to Niall's and O'Donnell Tuomey's. I spent less time in O'Donnell Tuomey's, but you can still see the influence of De Black and Mamar in their work, very definitely. It's kind of like a development. They obviously have their own voice and language, but there's you know, you can see things like in their furniture school in Letterfrack is kind of indebted to De Blackamamar or Can via De Blackamamar, and you know, but yeah, so that's a kind of not very clear explanation, but just the substance of the thing of the materials of how a building is built, and then the logic, the sequential logic of how it's built up, you know, whether it's frame, whether it's load-bearing masonry walls, that all that stuff obviously, you know, has an influence on the character and the spatial qualities of a building.
I mean, that's definitely something that's coming through the conversations I'm having. So it's in a way, I think it really, the way you're explaining it really articulates this sense that it's about detail. It's about this kind of one-to-one scale, or one-to-two scale. I was talking to Hugh Campbell. Yes, yeah. I was talking to Hugh Campbell, and he was saying how he worked for the Blackamamar in the early 90s for only a few years, but was saying how the scales were strictly 1 to 2, 1 to 20, and 1 to 200. And I just love that there is nothing between 1 to 20 and 1 to 200.
Yeah.
But this, and he's really put it really nice at it. There's a sense of directness in that.
Yeah.
And so then with O'Donnell Tuomey, I mean, I don't want to kind of say bluntly how do you compare it to Niall, but in the ethos of the practice, in the way that is there any interesting kind of parallel that you can make that then transfers into your work?
Absolutely, both practices have been influential on our own practice, and indeed Alice working for Tom de Boer has been a huge influence on our work. It's kind of difficult to kind of pull out one example of that. I think it's more just it's a kind of I feel like this stuff just sinks into you, and it comes out in a different way.
It's more cultural. It sounds, the way you speak about it, then it sounds a bit like it's a culture that you're a part of. And so maybe that takes us to this question of Irish architectural culture or culture of architecture that's in some way really like emerged in the past, let's say 2 decades or 3 decades, as a kind of very distinctive architectural culture. And I wonder if you ever think about why that is, or what is that kind of Irish condition that allowed this, I guess, what maybe was a scene to become such a kind of powerful force internationally. And
I think part of it is to do with the scale of Ireland and Dublin, and you kind of know most of the architects around. It's really quite small. Like we're good friends with people like Clancy Moore and Steve Larkin and Ryan Kennan. You know, we're just around the corner from each other where our offices are. We meet up for drinks. We're good friends, and we chat about things.
You compete for work.
We do, and we compete in some instances. We compete together.
Yeah. Okay.
For jobs, and it's all kind of we're each individually quite serious about our practices, but we're not serious in that way with each other. We're kind of more on more a friendly basis. I don't think I'm in a position to answer why Irish architectural culture is the way it is. I think there is a kind of a shared territory of interest amongst the kind of group of colleagues that we're friendly with, and although everyone is quite different, and but there is a kind of a shared territory of interest, and a shared territory of what is important to architecture, and also what isn't, what we don't tackle. We are kind of very focused on buildings and spaces and fabric, and I would say, not to put words in their mouth, but less kind of interested in how architecture can solve societal problems directly. I'm quite dubious about its capacity to do that on its own, so tend to stay away from things like that. But I think it's a quite a small and relatively coherent architectural culture, and it's you know mainly focused in Dublin, not exclusively, but that's mainly where the critical practices are. Not that that's any good thing, but it's a kind of a closeness. In contrast to London, where, as I was saying, we spent a few years and it felt like almost like every practice was an individual island, and there might have been kind of cliques of similar practices, but they're spread out so far across the city. There wasn't that kind of a coherency. And coherency can be a bad thing as well as, Irish architecture could be critiqued for a lack of diversity in some, in character in some ways, but there's pros and cons to this.
But I guess what's interesting about it, it takes me back to Joyce, where, the character in the Dubliners is told that they must leave, they must go away.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if there is something about, and you yourself embody a little bit that there is something about sort of going away and then coming back and, bringing influences, which is actually what Shane did in some way, and John.
Yeah.
John, do you feel that there is a sort of connection to the outside world that is kind of fluid?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I mean, definitely time spent in London and coming back was really influential. But in the period between being in London and coming back to Ireland, Alice and I actually did a year-long, essentially round the world trip to go see, it was a kind of backpacking thing, but very focused on seeing buildings like high architecture and also vernacular. And that has been, for us, has been super, super, super important and formative. And I think when we started our practice at the start, we kind of thought about ourselves as, let's say, neo-vernacular architects. Like everything was from the place where the project was. That's what we consciously thought about our work being. Like, understanding can't be vernacular in the true sense of the word in these times, but that everything was focused, like, what's the material in the place, what's the character of the place, and that's what we thought we were doing. But later on and through, we did PhDs where we kind of looked into this thing that there's kind of multiple contexts at play. There's not just the context of the place itself, the commonly understood one of material and form in the place, but there's that kind of context of the things that we'd seen in these really exotic kind of places and the vernaculars, and just things that have nothing to do with the place. They're another context that's kind of intertwining with the local context. So there is very much, and we're very conscious of it now, that there are a number of overlapping contexts. There's the local one, and then there's one that has nothing to do with it, which is just a kind of a trigger of something that you remember seeing, and that kind of gets fed into the design process, and that makes the thing the way it is. So it's not a simple thing of, this is, it's that going away and coming back. So you obviously work in a place, and I think the nature of the location is something that's very important to Irish architecture. That the place gives to the work, and I think that's a pretty consistent thread. But everyone has their own take on it, but ours, we're conscious now that our work is at least as equally influenced by things which have nothing to do with the specific place of the project.
That's amazing. So what in this world travel? I mean, on my notes here, and this is like, I don't know, I haven't read it in any of your interviews or anything like that, but I wrote down, what did I write down? Frank Lloyd Wright, believe it or not. But I just wonder, I recognize in some of those brick houses, there's a really beautiful project with this very heavy brick wall. And it just reminded me of something you'd seen in those Los Angeles projects. It had that quality to me. This is just,
wow.
I wonder, like, if you respond to this, whether there is anything of Frank Lloyd Wright, or there are other references, and where did they come from? What was the kind of most influential part of this year of travel? I wonder now.
There's those hero buildings that you want to go see, and some of them you see are slightly disappointing, and others that you kind of weren't kind of half bothered to see were like really profoundly amazing. But then it was the kind of the vernacular and how that changed as you move across the earth, and how the importance of the environment informing those things, but then also the belief system of the people in that place, and how the two of those kind of combine to create something really unique. And what's so beautiful about the vernacular wherever you go is it's kind of, for me, it's a register of the physical and belief environment kind of intertwined to make something that's just of that place. But also the landscapes, which is something that was really surprising to me, that thing that I wasn't really consciously interested in, really, but then you kind of go into these landscapes and you just find them so incredible and so moving, a lot of them. But then understanding how those landscapes in turn kind of feed into the constructed buildings, and even the belief systems. They make the belief systems, so all these things being rolled into one another, and then these kind of little instances of constructed things that capture all that. It's just found it so beautiful. And then I think that's why when we came back, we wanted to kind of do something like that, and so we thought we wanted to build things that were very much of their place. So consciously, that's what we were doing. But I think subconsciously, we were always feeding in these kind of outside things that we'd see in these ritual objects, or this way of arranging tiles, or in Brazil, or something in India. That has always been, looking back on that, it has always been part of our work. It's never been just kind of super local,
There seems to be a lot of playfulness with sort of fragments, a fragment being a brick, or fragment being a block,
or fragment being a spatial moment that we have seen somewhere else and go, that was a really beautiful moment. And then you try and put it in a project in Ireland, in somebody's back garden, and it's surrounded by blockwork versus mud and and it's impossible for it to be the same thing as it was, for better or worse. It will always be something new if you transport that fragment of that thing to somewhere else, no matter how faithfully you try and recreate it, which we don't really. We just get a sense of it. Once it's moved, it's new.
Is there also something in a kind of negotiating this relationship between the heavy and the light elements of a structure or building? That's a real strong sense that I get in your work, that the light, let's call them light elements, are so light, and the heavy elements are so. There's a real kind of they're almost two polar opposites.
Well, I think they always using those contrasts always brings out or heightens the material, the sense of each of them in opposition. So, at the back garden there's an old concrete block wall, and it's got this lovely patina on it, but we decided to paint the bottom half of it bright white. So then you have this really beautiful like heightening of the patina and the heightening of the white against each other. So there is a lot of that, but then there's other things like structural logic, sequence of construction, what can be light, what has to be heavy, vice versa. So there's always it's never straightforward. It's more like a kind of finding a recipe. But I think the thing about going back to CIAN and to Black Mamara and Niall and O'Donnell Tuomey, and it's the it's the way that the detail, like you can go into a detail and then you can pull out, and that influence the organization or the spatial quality or the circulation of bigger buildings. It's not the linear thing of going, plan, form, you know, room arrangement, all the way down to 1:2 details. It's not that. It's kind of, it can be, you know, a construction detail that comes back to the plan and then goes back to the detail, you know, yourself. It's a
It's
kind
almost
of,
a dialectic. It's a conversation, right?
yeah,
It's a constant.
because you can find something in a detail that then has implications about how you might organize spatially something, and then that can kind of feed back, as you say, it's kind of a conversation between scales. Yeah, I think we like to be on the edge of normal, so to speak, you know, like on the edge of like familiarity, I suppose is a better term for it. I mean, generally where our buildings can be seen, you know, could be seen by the public or in the public realm or something like that, we tend to err towards a kind of a familiarity, but obviously a tuned familiarity, you know, that things look like what you might expect them to look like. Like we did a cricket pavilion and it looks like a cricket pavilion, but it's not a traditional cricket pavilion. I think when we do things like hidden extensions in the back gardens of people's houses, like we feel like we have a little bit more liberty to just experiment and do something that is, you know, about itself, about creating a little world in there, and it's kind of freed a little bit from the shackles of its context. But when we're out in and visible, you know, I think we tend to err towards something that looks familiar, but then we might do something that subverts that familiarity at a level, you know, like create an 8-meter long window in a otherwise kind of vernacular looking form, you know, something that would would never get something like that in. So there's I think it's kind of like somewhere on the edge of familiarity is important to us, you know, that the buildings don't appear like you know, something dropped from another place into a context.
And is there any other sort of art form that comes into your way of thinking about space or building? Okay, so you really clearly articulate that the kind of vernacular architecture had a real strong resonance with you, you know, that year of travel. But I wonder, as a teacher, you've taught in many places, I wonder, I guess, where do the constraints come from, or where do what are we responding to as architects? Are we responding to a sort of history of architecture? Are we responding to an impression? Are we responding to a flicker of light, or is it film or photography or kind of like detailed technical understanding of the site?
Yeah, I don't feel like we look towards a specific kind of mode of art. I mean, like sometimes we're kind of more magpie-ish that way. Like a photograph could be amazing, or a piece of music or a piece of text could be, you know, interesting, but not comprehensively. You know, we don't comprehensively look at sculpture, although, you know, the projects we've looked at Anthony Caro's work and tried to, you know, that's influenced how we would make a metal screen or something like that. But I think it's always a balance of all, like what, you know, what are we responding to? It's always a balance of lots of different things, like budget constraints, the environment, the visible context, a gut feeling that you want to do something. You know, I want to make a blockwork interior, you know, that might be the starting point. Something that the client wants feeds into it. Then there's obviously regulations and trying to navigate your way through the regulations and not end up with banality at the end. So there's always, it's just like many layers, and you're just trying to negotiate your way through and yeah, see what comes out at the end. But there's usually something that guides it, you know, and it's usually a kind of an instinctive gut feeling about something that emerges quite close to the start of the project. And I like instinct to me isn't just kind of like a random, you know, it's built up from years of spatial interest or preference, or, you know, it's an educated thing. It's just not, it's not something that you can articulate in a rational way about why it's important. That doesn't mean it's not important, you know, that you feel like something should be, I just feel like that should be like that.
But I guess the thing that I'm interested in are those moments of tension in your work, because sometimes a thing looks too thin. There's like an element of almost a magic in it, and I wonder whether this is simply the instinct that there has to be that element of tension. Whether a wall looks, wow, what's in this? Is there a room in this wall? It's so thick. Or how is this thin roof possible? What's the trick?
But things like that like a razor thin edge to a roof, they're the moments of, I think, on the edge of familiarity, you know.
Okay.
So and we spend a lot of time, you know, detailing those and working them out technically and making sure that they can be the way they are. And you know, if we're using a product, it'll stay in its place and it'll have its warranty and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of effort goes into those moments of paring something down to be that fine. And that's the thing, I think, for us, shifts it from being familiar to being kind of somewhere, you know, on the edge of that familiarity. It's and it's tuned and it's heightened, and I think that kind of elevates the roofness of the roof. But there's I don't know if you're referring to it, but we did an extension that has this red yachting rope that holds up a canopy, and that's incredibly delicate.
That's true, yeah.
And that was kind of just like a gut feeling experiment. We wanted to do this because that relates back to things that we're fascinated about, these thatch cottages in the west coast of Ireland, that because the wind is so strong there, that the self weight of the thatch won't hold it down. It needs to be tied down and lashed down with these ropes. And we kind of loved that, like going back to what you were saying about the contrast of those really heavy stone cottages and this very fine piece of kind of rope that's tying them. You know, that there's something really beautiful about that. And then that's something we wanted to kind of play with in that extension and kind of almost suspend in a cat's cradle this canopy. You know, it's held up against the structure, obviously, because of its weight, but then it's held down to the ground because of the uplift of the wind. And there's something about that which is about a register of environmental forces, but then it's also about how you see the delicacy of that thing from the inside of the space, and it's kind of uncanny delicacy. You know, I think that's kind of important. There's a kind of a uncanniness to it, which I think it's not just about the detail, it's about the atmosphere of the space and how you see that in relation to the planting in the garden, and you know that the building is almost woven into the planting, and they're kind of becoming one and the same thing.
But also another interesting thing there is that you almost imply that this timber clad elevation is kind of so light that it could just be lifted. So in some way, you're also trick us into thinking that the entire elevation could be unfolded or pulled.
It's corrugated sheeting on the canopy, and then
okay.
But they're quite close. They're very thin pieces of timber and then thin corrugations on the things.
Okay.
Now you might get the impression that it's the facade and folded out.
Yeah.
It just seems very fitting that you might use Shane and the work of de Black and Mar as a kind of a conduit to that conversation about influence across time. And I do think that's another characteristic of Irish architecture, that people are taught by reference. You know, I would say suggest more so than in the UK, in my experience of UK education, that reference, as in previous architectural projects, be they from 1,000 years ago or the recent past, they're always used quite prominently as a means to educate a student about how it could be. You know, how it could be. It could be a bit like this. It could be a bit like this. You know, and I think that's an And then when we go on to be practitioners, like we still use that, you know, as a way. And there's no there's not really an anxiety about saying I was looking at this building or this part of this building. There's no, for us anyway, there's no
there seems to be a healthy relationship to
yeah, we're not trying to purport that everything we do is a divine inspiration and just comes in one flash. You know, we're part of
that's Peter Zumthor. That's Peter Zumthor.
Yeah.
He doesn't acknowledge
it's not we feel like we're part of a continuum, you know.
Culture.
Yeah. We rely on the things that have gone in the past to make things that are not like those. They're a bit like those, but they're a development or a different version of them, you know. So I think that is a kind of a common thread that